So I think we are live. The broadcast system is starting. So I think we have we are on air. And for those that are attending, I appreciate you joining. Hopefully you're getting logged in, and just gonna kind of get my activities here. One thing I'm not seeing, Bob, is the questions, but I think we can use the chat for questions.
Okay.
So for those that are attending, looks like there's about 12 of you on at this point. We've got about 93 people that have signed up. So I think we're just gonna go ahead and get started. I'm assuming everybody that is wanting to attend is here. So welcome to the part 4 of our webinar series between ERP Risk Advisors and SafePaaS. This one is gonna be focused on user access reviews. Hopefully those that are attending have attended the last couple series. There are links to the last the 3 sessions we've already done, and there are 2 more sessions coming up after this. At one point we were going to have a 5-part series, and now we've expanded this to a 6-part series. So look for those invitations and links coming up. But as I kind of continue to build out the kind of curriculum for the training and look at what we're going to talk about in this, I'm adding a few things in here into this session here and there, some more things that I think that are really helpful to round out the kind of the whole access controls understanding, and then specifically how this ties into user access reviews. So I spent quite a bit of time last night working through this presentation, and I'm excited to share some new material that I think will hopefully you as practitioners and auditors will be able to take advantage of. So joining me today is Bob Enders as well. He's going to be helping facilitate the demo and some discussion later, and I'm super happy to have Bob participate, and he's been a valuable resource to help us understand how the SafePaaS platform works in past sessions. So welcome, Bob.
Welcome, everybody.
So we do have CPE available. This, I think, will probably go longer than 50 minutes today, so must be in session for 50 minutes. And if you, at the end of the session, attended and want CPE, you can send a email to us, open a ticket, and we'll generate a CPE certificate. We have some prerequisites I think that would be helpful. So whenever we do a training class, we talk about the things maybe that would be beneficial for you that are giving you some context related to the topic, and then that's really that first top section. We have 3 classes that we have available on our learning platform, and those are the 3 that we have listed up there: the custom roles, data security policies, privileges. That's a presentation that Donna Curtis did. She's an ERP Cloud practice manager, and that gives you kind of a broad level of the components of roles and understanding roles in ERP Cloud a little bit better. And then we have 2 other webinars that we have for 23A and 23B that are pre-recorded. All 3 of those classes are available for 1 hour CPE as well. If you want to listen back through those, and that's on our learning platform, we can enroll you in those. And then there are links that the SafePaaS team can give you to the prior sessions. So session 1 was focused on role design. Session 2 was user provisioning and role change management. Session 3 was really the impact of patches from a security perspective, but Bob also looked at some ways to use SafePaaS platform to look at some configuration changes from patch to patch. That's a significant challenge there for organizations. So our agenda for today is we're going to look at risks that need to be monitored. We're going to dive into kind of readdressing some of the context of the webinars we've done in past, talking about what SOD and sensitive access conflicts are, and then build on that a little bit as we're talking about user access reviews. Talk about our rule set, ERP Armor for ERP Cloud, the rules engine that allows you to use SafePaaS software most effectively to be able to identify, manage, and mitigate risks in ERP Cloud roles. And then we're going to get into the 10 different topics. This is really the whole series, is what are the 10 different scenarios about using ERP Armor and SafePaaS to test access controls. And then what I'm going to cover in more detail today is this concept of defining what's relevant or what are in scope rules. So I've got a whole new series of slides that I brought in based upon another class that I've been working on that is really understanding how to map relevant IT dependent controls from your risk and control matrix and be more precise or specific about what rules need to be considered as part of whatever your compliance regulations are, whether it's a cyber risk approach, a SOX/compliance perspective, or you're looking at fraud or data security, some other things in there. So I'm excited to share some new material with you guys today. And then we're going to get into specifically at that point the user access review and recertification process within SafePaaS and how that helps facilitate that. So I always like to say risks are not just compliance risk. We think of, for those of us that are based in the US, a lot of the focus on access control testing and identity management is focused on compliance risks. There are risks well beyond that. So we like to think of fraud. So fraud is a component of Sarbanes-Oxley for sure, but it's more material fraud than what we would call submaterial or ordinary or operational fraud. So I think of fraud in two contexts: material potential to have a material misstatement in the financial statements, or those that are just less material or submaterial fraud risks. We should also be looking at operational risk, certainly access controls, and user access review should focus on cyber security. And then we're going to look at licensing risks in a future state. So license risks is over provision, over usage of permissions that could lead to an audit from Oracle's perspective that cause some financial heartache, so to speak, by having to pay for more licenses than perhaps you should or need to. So in terms of the stakeholders, it's the C-suite, CFO, CIO, CISO, SOX, PMO, COO. All stakeholders should really care about access controls. And so it's not just focused on compliance, but it is focused on broader operational and other attributes in terms of the organization. So I like to revisit the topic sensitive access risks and SOD risk, segregation duties risk and sensitive access risk defined. What we find in the use of access control software like SafePaaS is there's really a focus on segregation duties risks, and that is a risk primarily from a compliance perspective, but there's a lot of, I would say, less maturity focusing on sensitive access risks, and we're going to dive into that today a little bit. We've talked about that a lot in the last couple sessions, but we're going to dive into more details. So we think about what is an SOD conflict. An SOD conflict is a combination of activities. It's enter and maintain suppliers is one activity, and enter and maintain payables invoices is the second activity. So it's the combination of those two risks. You're not looking at the access individually, you're looking at the aggregation of risk. And so what we like to say is, instead of focusing on segregation duties as a starting point, you really should be focusing on sensitive access risks. And by addressing sensitive access risks appropriately, which is asking the question of does anybody have access to a vendor master maintenance as an example where they shouldn't? Then if we did that in the first hand starting point of evaluating and making sure no roles are over provisioned with that ability, and then we did that with purchase orders, for example, as a second sensitive access risks, then we're more than likely going to solve the issue of SOD conflicts. So if there is an SOD conflict, it's usually because somebody has access to one side or the other that they shouldn't. So it's a buyer having access to suppliers, or it's an AP clerk having access to purchase orders where they shouldn't. So that's why we take a sensitive access risk approach first and a segregation of duties risks second. And then in general, if you're looking for the aggregation of risk, and let's just say you have an IT user that has and maintains suppliers that shouldn't. If you're looking for an aggregation of risk, if you don't run the sensitive access risk, then you might not realize that there is a user or group of users that have access to just that risk or just that activity in and of itself. And there are significant risks from a compliance and a fraud perspective on individually these components. I think most people really understand and get the concept of vendor master maintenance being a risk in and of itself. you could just modify an existing vendor. That's really the risk associated with vendor master maintenance. So a vendor is already set up. There's invoices processed against it on a regular basis. There's purchase orders associated with it. So to the extent that you can inappropriately and fraudulently maintain either from an ACH perspective or an EFT perspective, the bank account information, so the routing information and the bank account number, or if they're being paid via check, the name and the address information where that information is being routed, or another thing that could be fraudulently maintained is the contact information. So somebody could go in and change the contact information to somebody they know that becomes a threat actor, or to themselves, and then they would send a letter in that says, hey, we need to make a change to our bank account. And a normal process would be somebody would be reaching back out to the approved contacts on the account, and they would use that contact information to try to verify that the letter was coming in from an authorized source. So those are a few examples of updates to vendor master data that would cause a risk in and of itself. Certainly creating a fictitious vendor in and of itself is a risk as well. It's just oftentimes that becomes necessary for a combination of something else to happen, or for money to be paid in a fraudulent manner. So an invoice has to be sent in, which there's often invoice approval processes that have to be done prior to a vendor being paid. So I'd like to talk specifically kind of more of the update risks for sensitive access related to vendor master as a primary risk from that can easily lead to fraud. So we want to focus a lot on sensitive access risk first and segregation duty second, and that leads me to this slide. And even in the context of when we're looking at SOD risks, from a compliance perspective, people typically think that those risks are mitigated through workflow approval processes, and we're going to talk about how there are backdoor ways of updating and maintaining data that don't go through workflow. But it's important, certainly in the front end, to understand what workflow processes have been implemented and when you're addressing both SOD and sensitive access risks. So just to put the context of when you're looking at access controls, and specifically how you're looking at the rules engine that goes into SafePaaS software to be able to look at SOD and sensitive access risks. The rules would be consisting of privileges mapped to sensitive access rules. So like who has the ability to enter and maintain suppliers, for example. Duty roles mapped to sensitive access rules. There are risks associated with data security policies that also are built into sensitive access rules, and then effectively the aggregation of those risks, the pairs of sensitive access risks built into are what we think of as segregation duties conflicts. I'm adding some new data here, I think, that we haven't looked at in prior webinars, which is kind of looking more specifically at some of the privileges out there that are high risk. I think I may mention this on the last webinar, but if you weren't on the third, but you were on the first or the second, I've talked about some examples of create manual SLA journal entries. If you're coming from a e-business suite environment, you'll understand that there's one function in there that allows you to bypass the workflow approval process. So there's an article I wrote a long time ago called "The One Function That Can Undermine Your Journal Entry Controls." That was for EBS. So the on-prem version, if you want to call it, of the ERP Cloud. That same risk does exist in the ERP Cloud. It's the managed subledger journal entry manually privilege that allows somebody to define which source it is they use to be able to submit a journal entry. And we have an article on that topic. The other sensitive access risk we would like to highlight that is kind of pervasive in ERP Cloud environment is the Access FSCM Integration REST service, which is a SCM and financials REST API that is in a lot of seated roles. It's a fairly common issue driving why we want to customize roles, because this function is in a lot of end user roles for the the financials and supply chain side. So that, if you want to understand more about that, there's a link here to an article where we convinced Oracle to pull out that FSCM API privilege from the employee role. At one point, it was actually an employee role, so all employees had access to the most powerful REST API on the supply chain and financial side. And you'll see some back and forth and understanding related to the Oracle's analysis on that. I'm going to go on to the next slide here. From another area, I think that's just that I want to reemphasize that lots of organizations don't really look at from an SOD perspective, from a high risk segregation duties, is making sure that there's a breaking apart of the transactions versus configurations related to things that like, for example, go through workflow approval. So journal approval workflow is going to be relying upon journal sources configuration and managed ledger options configuration. And from an integrity of the system perspective, you don't want somebody to have the ability to be able to enter and maintain configurations or make a change to configurations, undermining the control design, and then also have the ability to transact against those activities. So in this example here, they could make a change to a journal sources configuration. They could take a source of manual or source of spreadsheet and say that the journal entry isn't required for those sources, go enter a journal entry then that would not be subject to the journal approval workflow, bypassing effectively the intent of the control by management. So that's an example of a couple of examples of SOD conflicts that you might not think of, you might not have in your risk libraries as it relates to using your access control software. All right, so I'm going to get into some new material here, determining what rules are relevant or what are in scope rules. We talked about this just briefly in the last slide. When you're using access control software, there are various different reasons why you would want to evaluate access control. So regulatory requirements such as Sarbanes-Oxley, JSOX, UK SOX, and so on. Cybersecurity, data security, fraud, license overages. So when I talk about in scope, what we want to do is say which rules, which SOD and sensitive access rules do we apply to which requirements. So Sarbanes-Oxley is primarily focused on material misstatement, or the ability to materially change the financial statements, which is very different because of the concept of materiality than if you're just looking at things purely from a fraud perspective, or what we call submaterial fraud risk. Or if you're in charge of data security, you're going to be focusing more on sensitive access risks that give access for people to be able to see and extract data. So, data theft, PII or PHI or GDPR type data theft, which is driven mostly by privileges, but also driven by, to be most precise, driven by data security policies. So those are just some of the driving forces behind access control testing. And what I want to spend some time talking about today is how risk and control matrix generally address automated controls, or ITACs, which is primarily driven by workflow design. So the challenge organizations have, and when they're looking at the design of controls, and I'm gonna go to the bottom half of the screen and talk about this example control description. It says Oracle's configured using workflow such that manual journal entries and batches are approved by appropriate management prior to posting in both ERP and FCCS. So that is a common control definition that focuses on making sure that the workflow process is enabled and it's being used for all, well, predominantly most types of journal entries, so manual or non-standard journal entries. And what I'm going to challenge you right now as you're thinking about from a control design perspective is that's not the only control that really should be in your risk control matrix. It is a control that should be there focusing on the workflow-based process, and you should be doing walkthrough of that process, making sure that the configurations support the control objectives. But going to the middle part of the screen, there are several different ways that privileges can be used to bypass approval workflows. APIs, web services, data conversion processes, think of FBDI abilities, Excel spreadsheets, the HCM data loader process, or Maybe there's an integrated solution you're using that has an Excel front end that is using APIs, and then customizations and on-prem systems. So there are ways that there are risks associated with certain privileges that are not governed by workflow process, and therefore we would argue that there needs to be a separate set of controls that would address these risks. So if I focus specifically on journal entries, and we have a full class on risks and controls in the journal entry process that goes into these in a lot more details. There are what we identify as 12 different scenarios where of how journal entries are entered and or maintained within the application. So if your focus from a control design perspective is on the workflow process, and so back to this control description, Oracle's configured such that journal entries go through approval process, right? So somebody's reviewing it prior to posting it. The question is, have you evaluated all the ways that don't follow that process? So let me just kind of go through some examples here. Certainly the journal entries that are entered through the UI, so the forms of the pages to the front end, typically are governed by that, because in the journal sources form, you would say that the source of manual, which is what's being driven by the UI, would be subject to the journal approval workflow. The next one, upload from a spreadsheet. So it's the Excel-based templates. This is the ADFDI process, where when you use an ADFDI template, it defaults as a source of spreadsheet. So it's got an automatically defaulted source. You can't override that source. It's baked into the way that the template's built. That would then be subject to the journal approval workflow. Where it gets tricky is, are there abilities to have user configurable sources? And that's really back to, if I go back to this override subject, if I go back to the slide here, we talk about the create manual SLA journal entries, which is a rule we have, FC 185, that looks at two specific privileges. The second part of this manual subledger journal entry manually allows you to do exactly what I just described. It allows you to use a template, an FBDI template specifically, that gives you the ability to define any source. And typically there are sources, the subledger sources are not subject to journal approval workflow. So that is a real risk in both EBS and ERP Cloud. And that's the scenario number 3, is the uploading a spreadsheet with a user configurable source that is not subject to the journal approval workflow. So the question you have to ask is, how are we managing that risk in the risk in your RACM? Is it an assumption that that ability or abilities are not available to anybody because it should never be used? If so, then effectively you're relying upon your role design process to be able to make sure that there are no roles ever to anybody assigned that have that ability. The reality is that if you're using seated roles, that privilege is in several seated roles or many seated roles that allows somebody, not even just the general accounting roles or the accounting roles, but they're in some other subledger roles that you wouldn't even think they would be there. So the only way to effectively test this process, or test to make sure that nobody has access to that, if that is really the intent, is nobody should have access to that privilege, is to be precise about your role design, precise about your role change management process, precise about your user provisioning process. There are seated roles that will be out there forever that have that ability. So does your user provisioning process say that these roles, these seated roles, should not be assigned because of the risk associated with it? So even like defining your user provisioning process, and it's not just for end users, but it's IT users, it's everybody. So that risk exists for everybody. You shouldn't just say, well, as long as we have our end user roles defined appropriately, then we're in good shape. But the reality is, if there are cases where IT users get access to those roles, those seated roles that have those privileges, then that risk exists. So I would argue you really can't do, most organizations can't eliminate this risk just through good user provisioning controls. There has to be certainly has to be a concerted effort on an ongoing basis to make sure it doesn't get introduced through role change management. And we talked about in our last session on patch change management, you also have to verify that Oracle's not adding that into another role or building a new role that you don't know of that shouldn't be provisioned as part of the quarterly patch process. So that's another reason, like just to emphasize what we talked about in the last session on patch change management. You really should be doing a comprehensive analysis of user access controls every time the patch is applied, which is on a quarterly basis, which would be leveraging software like SafePaaS to be able to be running those SD intensive access analyses during the patching cycle as the patch is applied to production, and making sure that you're addressing potentially any new risks that are introduced by Oracle. So that's a pretty big gap in lots of organizations, and effectively, if I looked at the RACM, we're not going to find a control that is precise enough to point to that says, yes, management does have the right controls in place to prevent the assignment of a privilege that should not be assigned to anybody ever because of the compliance risks associated with it. I did mention that particular example, there really is no look back procedures. Using an FBDI template to be able to upload a journal entry to a spreadsheet. Now, the good news is, but I shared a little bit of bad news and it's a little bit of good news in the last webinar. The good news is in 22B, Oracle introduced some new functionality, some new privileges that would allow you to take away the FBDI ability from accountants in production. Prior to 22B, every accountant had both the ADFDI ability and the FBDI ability, or the ability to upload either template and effectively bypass your journal approval workflow. So if you're not familiar with that topic, I would either suggest going back and looking at the part 3 of this that we didn't talk about in the last webinar, or we have a specific webinar on 22B, which is one of the prerequisites, and we can enroll you into that. But effectively, if you have not made changes to your accounting roles in the last few months to address this issue, then you are at risk for a significant finding from an external audit perspective. So feel free, if you're not familiar with it, to either look at that 22B webinar, get enrolled in that, and that's on our learning platform, or just open a ticket with us, and I'll point you to where that is, and you can do some due diligence on behalf of your organization. So, kind of going back to determining what rules are relevant in looking at your access controls, we've talked about these first 3. There's allocations as another activity within ERP Cloud that also existed in EBS, if you're familiar with that. Allocations are formula-based activities to be able to often it's used to be able to allocate balances or create recurring journal entries. But that is another privilege that needs to be secured, and controls need to be defined associated with that. That is really not even a manual or non-standard journal entry. It is a specific type of allocations, I guess is the way to think about it. So that would be another type of control that would need to be baked into your journal entry controls and your risk control matrix, is how allocations are being managed. You could either have the control at the time the allocations are entered are set up, or at the time that the allocation journal entries are executed. And you'd want to make sure you have the right controls in place related to that. So I'm going to move on from here. I've got quite a bit more topics on this. I'm going to go into another what rules are relevant scenario, and what I see often that management and auditors do wrong. And this is where you have an integration between 2 systems. So like, for example, maybe you have a procurement system where you're doing onboarding suppliers and requisitions and POs, like a product like Coupa. Maybe it's your legacy purchasing system, and maybe eventually you're going to transition that to ERP Cloud, but you don't have that in phase 1. So you'd be onboarding suppliers. It's a system of records for suppliers. You'd be entering and maintaining purchase orders. It's a system record for purchase orders. And then effectively, once that data is entered in Coupa, it gets interfaced into your financial system, in this case, Oracle ERP Cloud. because you need suppliers for AP invoice processing, but it's not your system of record. So what we see wrong with organizations in scoping both their controls and not looking at access controls appropriately is not thinking about the implications of what is the source system, what's the target system, what is the system of record, and what is the system that shouldn't be we should be entering and maintaining suppliers. So in Coupa, you'd have the ability to enter and maintain suppliers, but since it's a system of record for suppliers, you should not be entering or maintaining that data in the financial system. So Oracle ERP Cloud in this example. So access control testing in that environment would be looking for, does anybody have the ability to enter maintain suppliers in Oracle ERP Cloud where they shouldn't? Or does anybody have the ability to enter and maintain purchase orders where they shouldn't? So what you should be verifying in your controls is that users do not have the ability to enter and maintain suppliers in the system where they shouldn't, because the other system is the system of record. So that's, if we were looking at what rules are relevant to run from an SOD incentive access in Coupa, we'd be looking at enter and maintain suppliers, enter maintaining purchase orders, and just verifying that the right roles had access to that. In the financial system, in ERP Cloud, what we'd be doing is be running rules, the sense of access rules, enter maintain suppliers, enter and maintain purchase orders against all users, and verifying that nobody has access to maintain any of that information at all in your financial system. It should just be view only. If you did have a reason to maintain data within those, like say there's some component of suppliers that you are going to say that should be maintained, then now you went from a risk and control matrix perspective, you have to have controls in your Coupa system relating it to whether they're effectively testing for unauthorized changes to suppliers, and you have to have controls in your financial system. And that isn't unusual. So I'm going to go to this next scenario where maybe your procurement system is focusing on the onboarding of suppliers, but the banking data is actually being entered in the financial system. So in that case, in Coupa, I want to say specifically in ERP Cloud, when you're designing the controls, you have to have the right controls related to supplier bank information, and your contact information would have to be maintained in ERP Cloud, so that, like, if you get a letter in the mail and the letter says, please change our banking data, you have the right, you don't have somebody inadvertently updating or fraudulently updating the contact information. So that's where we see, again, the precision of the RACM. The RACM may not even, it may just say there's 1 mega control related to supplier data, enter maintaining supplier data, and effectively what the end result is, the RACM may not be precise enough, or may not even consider the fact that there are 2 different types of controls, one that is focused on the Coupa risks and one that's focused on the ERP Cloud risks. Thinking about this scenario. I know I'm a little bit long on time right now. There's I'm going to go through just this next section really relatively quickly, but I'm just saying I just wanted to give you some broader perspective on scoping the RACM and the rules. We have seen cases where it's been significantly wrong done by other auditors or predecessors prior to us coming in and doing the work. And I think I'm just going to leave it here, just saying it's not, when you're looking at a system, and I'll maybe go back to this scenario here, procurement, the Coupa and the ERP Cloud system, the questions you really need to ask is what can be done in each system, not what is being used. And then talking about the integration of data between the systems. So identifying what the system of record is. So back to this example here, what can be done in ERP Cloud is onboarding suppliers and maintaining suppliers. What should be done is just managing banking data. So how do you apply a sense of access analysis and how do you design controls over just that scenario? A lot of times when people are scoping systems, they really just think about this is the only thing that should be being used. So an example back here of where we've got a pure segregation between suppliers and POs, and then the view only, you really should be focusing, like I said, testing on those sense of access risks. It's what can be used in ERP Cloud, not what should be used. So I am working on a very complex class on viewing the RACM, and there's another case study. Maybe I can squeeze this into one of these other sessions coming up of what we ended up having to do with a client that frankly had a prior auditor massively misscope both the systems that were relevant to the audit and the individual processes within the audit. So if you're, if that is your area of interest, then I would say I have a class coming out right now that's really focused on more completely and precisely scoping your in-scope risk from a RACM perspective. So this session, so how am I going to tie this into user access reviews and recertifications? The reason this is relevant in this session is because your user access reviews or recertifications need to be precise enough. When you do recertify the access that happens on an ongoing basis, it's not just enough to look at the users and the roles, but the process owners, the control owners should be looking at what is in those roles and are the roles appropriate, and are those appropriately designed, and the people that have access to those roles, are they is the access still appropriate given their job function? Has the job function changed, and so on? So this is the whole series. I've talked about the 10 different scenarios that SafePaaS software and ERP Armor can be should be being used to test access controls, role design, and so on. And these are the various different parts. We're in part 4 right now. We're going to talk about user access reviews, and you can see part 5 and part 6. We're covering cyber risk analysis, testing independent control performers in part 5, and in part 6 we're going to look at look-back procedures and license exposure. So now I want to get into the meat of this, and I'm going to get Bob here in a minute to be able to go through the functionality in SafePaaS. But suffice to say, I want to just reiterate the fact that what should be being presented to your process owner as they're going through the recertification process is the roles assigned. So all users and all roles should go through that. There should be no exceptions. The recertification should be complete 100% as of a point in time. All roles and all users and all roles assigned to them. And what the PCAOB has been kind of hammering the external auditors on is what is the precision of the review. So that's the terminology that's being thrown around in the audit community. Is the review precise enough? And what that means is when a process owner is looking at the roles assigned to an individual user, do they really understand what is in those roles? And so this is where we would be using the data. We'd be running a full analysis of what's in a role, and we're either going to look at a roll-up of those privileges, what we call the rules. So this is our sensitive access rules. So like, for example, when an AP manager would be looking at an AP supervisor role and say, do the people that have access to this role, is there anything they have access to that they shouldn't? Or the question they should be asking. How we train our customers that are using SafePaaS software and our rules to do this is we would be looking at it more from a rule perspective. There's no way for you to understand every privilege in the system and what those privileges do. So we aggregate those privileges and duty roles and DSPs, combining those into sensitive access rules. And we give you a logical understanding of what those groupings are. So for example, AP invoice supervisor has the ability to create manual SLA journal entries. So I talked about the ability to upload an FBI template to create a manual journal entry that bypasses a journal approval workflow. That ability, or more than one of those abilities, one or more of those abilities, I would say, is in the accounts payable invoice supervisor role. So it's not even a general accounting role or a general ledger role. It's in an AP role. So if I'm a process owner looking at the data, as Bob will show here in a minute, and I see create manual SLA journal entries, I'm going to ask the question, why is it my AP supervisor has the ability to bypass the workflow process? Now, this is maybe even cryptic to you. Like, what does create manual SLA journal entries mean? That's where we come in as your risk advisory partner. Effectively, is we will work with you on a quarterly basis, or as often as this is needed, to be able to get you to understand what this nomenclature is. Most people will look at an AP supervisor and say, okay, I understand they should have the ability to create, maintain AP invoices. That's approved. But I don't understand this create manual SLA journal entries, or I don't understand the high risk sourcing processes. I don't understand what asset mass additions are. Our responsibility as your partner in this is to help you understand what those are, what those abilities are, either at the rule level here, or if you really want to know the details, we'll help you understand the privileges. So this is the privilege view of that role. And this privilege down here, manage subledger journal entry manually, that is the privilege that is rolled up into this create manual SLA journal entries function. So what you should be doing over time is getting your process owners to be conversant in these risks, either at the rule level or the privilege level or both. So when they see during the recertification process, my AP invoice supervisor has import conversion processes, I know that that's not allowable, or at least there's going to be somebody there to help them guide them through that process. If they don't understand this level of detail, then their user access review, the recertification is not precise enough, and effectively your control is ineffective. I mean, that's what the PCAOB is expecting, that the external auditors are expecting from you as clients. All right, so getting into the demo here, user access reviews certifications, more than just testing user access, not just looking at the roles. Sensitive access risks must be recertified. So you should be looking at that role view that we just looked at, or role privilege, and saying, does the access, the activities that each individual user has as part of their job or position, is it still necessary in order for that to happen? And this last one here, I'm going to say, what happens if someone becomes a control performer during the period and their access was not removed? That we're going to cover in detail in the next topic, because that is a real risk as well. Let's say somebody's moved in the organization and now you have a different AP manager, or the change in the house, there's a change in how controls are being performed. And at some point in the quarter, somebody gets access to, or somebody just becomes a control performer, they already have access to, let's say they already have access to the AP invoice supervisor, so your AP manager has this, and they have the ability to enter and maintaining invoices, but you have a control in and around approval of invoices that happens. We're going to cover this concept of what happens if a control performer has access to the things that they're supposed to be reviewing in the next session. So not only should we be revalidating and recertifying sensitive access risk, we also should be recertifying SOD conflicts. And that's where it's essential that you have software to be able to do that, not only to manage the user access review, but also to give the information to the process owners to see the sensitive access risks and the SOD conflicts associated with it. So I am going to open up our recording here that Bob did, and Bob's going to walk us through this recording. And I need to get this. Let's see, webinars, and Bob is going to come online and walk you through this in a second here. SafePaaS webinar, and we're looking at user access reviews, and this is specifically. So Bob, if you can take them through some of the configurations you have in SafePaaS, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. What I want to show you now is how you set up a user access review within SafePaaS. It's also important to note that you can use databases, operating systems, networks for the certification process. We're going to look at some of the setups initially. One of the things that we want to provide is identify the role groups, and the role groups come from the ERP itself. So you can designate which areas you want to decide that you're going to scope roles associated with different role groups. As you can see, we have accounts payable, general ledger, human resources. In each one of those role groups, you want to scope the actual roles themselves. So here's all the roles that appear when you select the role group, and you can, just by clicking on the checkbox, turn them on or turn them off, and they'll, by turning them off, they'll be excluded from the new certification review. Following that, you want to identify the reviewers and the approvers that are going to be viewing the role group or the roles. And if you look at the role group, you can drill down into the details. So by looking at accounts payable, I could have a primary owner and a secondary owner for review and approval process. So if I select those individuals, it's basically from a drop down, and I save that information, it'll automatically assign those reviewers and approvers to all the roles that are in that role group. Now I have the opportunity to manage by exception. So if there's certain roles that I want to change the reviewer and the approver, I can easily do that. In this case, I'm selecting Naruto. That role has got to be reviewed by this person as opposed to the GRC admin person that's defined in the previous roles. So it helps you, once again, ease the setup process and manage the data appropriately. The next thing you want to do is you want to initiate the certification review. And it's a pretty straightforward process. There's a create button that you click on. And when you click on the create button, you can decide the environment, which in this case is Oracle Cloud. But you also have access groups and risk levels that you can decide if you want to select as part of the review. So it'll filter out the data only to those access groups or risk levels. So if I want to look at high risk roles more frequently, I can easily do that. And it'll filter out all those that don't fall under that risk level category. Once again, you can do the access group, and then also you can do the risk level as defined with each one of those roles. So here we entered the name, we provided the description, and then we go look at the start date. So the start date will default to the current date, and then the end date you can define whatever the time frame might be. In this case, we select the date in the future. I'm getting ahead of my work, but I want to only pick starting August 21st through the 31st. And then also it's important to note that there's a verification or an end date action process. And what this tells you is that if the process owner does not complete his review in a timely fashion, what do you want to do with those roles that are still open for review? I can terminate access or I can verify them. For high risk ones, I may want to terminate those because obviously the nature of being high risk, if I don't get a review and approval, I can terminate their access. And SafePaaS doesn't terminate the access. It creates what we call a corrective action within SafePaaS that you would either do it directly from SafePaaS into the ERP, or you can send it to a ticketing system like ServiceNow and then have a manual step in the process to actually terminate someone's request. So the next thing I'm going to show you is that when you're in the when you submit the certification review, it'll send an email notification to each one of the process owners. What you're looking at right now is an example of what'll occur. So this particular process owner has all the users, each user's access, and then they can make a determination as to what they want to do. You can verify them all if the person is confident and comfortable that everything's correct. You can verify them all, or you can terminate them all. Or you can do just the opposite. You can just go through each one individually and decide if you want to access, verify their access, or terminate their access as this process owner sees fit. You can do the same thing by verifying them all and then just doing the exception. Once again, it's the way we can simplify and be more efficient in the review process. Also, while you're doing these reviews, you'll notice here I saved it. I can come back at a later date. Now this information sits in the reporting capabilities within SafePaaS. So if I go back into SafePaaS while I'm reviewing the access, I can also open up the SOD analysis, or I can look at some of the certification details. Some of the filters are left on, so I'm going to select the certification review, in this case audit training user access review, and I got a graphical representation of the data. Or I can look at the rows and columns and then use that information as part of my review process. As I mentioned, you can also go into the Enterprise Access Monitor for looking at some of the violation reports. And from there, you can look at the potential violations that are being generated by this particular user having this specific role. And so I can now go into the individual, look for the users that I'm focused on in the access review process, filter by that particular individual. And it's easy to do within SafePaaS. All you got to do is just highlight the user, heading, and then pick the one that you're looking for, or you can search for it. It'll bring that information up and it'll give you all the details of the behind the violation for that particular user. Thank you.
All right, thanks Bob for that. It was a brief introduction. There's a lot of functionality there, and we certainly could have covered that in a lot more detail, but hopefully it gave people a good understanding of the way that recertifications happen. And thanks for going through how you provide users ability also to see the functionality within those roles, the sense of access risks and SD conflicts. It's a solid offering we have as a team to be able to pull to help organizations become more mature in their user recertification processes and be more responsive, I guess, to what we're seeing as audit requirements. So hopefully there's, I can't see questions, so I apologize. Maybe you can chat to me, but I'm not seeing the questions in the chat box. So if you have specific questions on this, you can certainly feel free to send me an email. And I've got the email address here in a second, but I'm going to wrap up just by saying we have a couple more parts coming up in the series. The next one we're going to cover how to respond from a cyber incident perspective. So just say that there are people that have had their credentials breached. How do we help scope that? So we're going to be looking at that. And then also the testing of independence and control performers. If you've been in this industry for a while and you're kind of familiar with the implications of, or what led to Sarbanes-Oxley, a lot of it was management overriding controls. And what I'm going to talk about in this next session, and I'm going to challenge you, I think, just to maybe do a little homework on this, is I think really the audit community is missing a very significant issue in the testing of access controls, and that is making sure that management doesn't have the ability to override controls. And so I put together some methodology, and we're going to talk about in this next session about how do we test that the people that are performing the controls, I'm referring here to control performers, are really independent of the activities they are overseeing. And it's a more of a challenge than you would think because of the way the RACMs are built. So it's kind of like I would say it's the gap, it's kind of the chasm between the financial audit team and the IT audit team that exists. And I think that, to be honest, most organizations aren't doing this. And given the fact that this is one of the major drivers behind the management override controls was the major drivers behind Sarbanes-Oxley, I think this is a massive gap in the way that audits are performed, both from an external audit perspective and an internal audit perspective. So I actually have an article on this, and if you're interested in reviewing it prior to the next webinar coming up in a couple weeks, or just in general, you want to look at it and have some interchange with me, or just understand how I'm making this argument, you can open a ticket with us and we'll send you the article back. And then coming up 2 weeks after that, we're going to look at look-back procedures and license exposure. Look-back procedures, I think most people understand the concept of somebody having access to something that's over-provisioned. Do they do something with that access? That's look-back procedures. And license exposure is kind of a topic all in itself. Are organizations at risk for license audits with Oracle? And the nice thing about ERP Cloud is there is visibility into what Oracle is using. So they give you the privileges that they're looking at from a licensing perspective. So it's fairly easy to figure out where you're over provisioned. The challenge, I think, is how do you remediate that access? And we're doing quite a bit of work there right now with clients on remediating license exposure, reducing the privileges that are in the roles. The short version of that is if you're using seated roles, you're either paying way too much for licenses, or you're at risk for license audit and exposure because the seated roles are, let's just say they favor Oracle on that. So we're going to talk about that in part 6. So that's the topic I talked about. The suggested next homework is this article. It's really trying to understand where manual controls are being performed. This is kind of a preview of what we're talking about the next session. If the control is listed as a manual control, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have IT dependency. It does have an IT dependency in that. You should be testing that as a team. The financial audit team, the IT audit team should be working together to validate that the person performing the control doesn't have access. So just because it's a manual control doesn't mean it's not something that you should worry about as an IT auditor. So if you're interested in that article, looking at it, you can open a support ticket for us by emailing us support@erpra.net. And then, of course, if you like the series, if you like what we've been talking about, there is a great partnership between SafePaaS and ERP Risk Advisors. And what we provide from ERP Risk Advisors is what we call a subscription, ERP Armor subscription. It's a relatively low cost subscription on an annual basis that provides you unlimited risk advisory services. We're always here to support you and your admins of administrators of SafePaaS to be able to get the most value out of that software and the rules. We do a quarterly patch analysis of all the ERP Cloud updates, and we're updating our sensitive access rules and SOD conflicts on a quarterly basis. So we're going to keep you current on the risks. We do recommend quarterly calls for us to interact with your team. What remediation is necessary, what's the progress on it. We help you track those things. So that's kind of what we expect from a risk advisory perspective. Suggested changes to roles based upon what's new in a patch. We do bring those to our clients, like the FBDI and ADFDI privilege that we mentioned that we found in 22B. We've talked to our clients about transitioning their roles. We can also do those role modifications if necessary for clients. And then we help implement SafePaaS software with our rules. SafePaaS has training on this as they bring you on as a client, but we also have our own pre-built training that integrates our concepts, our rules, if you will, in these 10 different access control scenarios with SafePaaS software. So our goal is to not just our goal is to really to make sure that you have to get the most value out of SafePaaS software and testing access controls, and then you're applying that to not just compliance, but cybersecurity risks, data security risks, and some other things. So we have a series of classes we can take you through. If you transition administrators, you have somebody leaves the organization, or you're transitioning who's participating in the day-to-day administration of SafePaaS, and we'll help you walk through that process and help support you to make sure you're getting, it doesn't fall through the cracks, so to speak. So the next two series are coming up. The cyber incident look back procedures. Invite you to sign up for our monthly newsletter if you haven't yet. And then we're offering 4.5 hours of free CPE as part of this webinar. You get an hour for today if you're interested. So you can email us at support@erpra.net, and we'll give you CPE for today. There's 3 other classes, custom roles class, the 23A and 23B classes that are available. And then we're offering, tying a lot of these concepts together. We have a 1-hour CPE, highly valuable, impactful class called Why Access Control Should Be Tested for All Unscoped Systems. It's a $299 value. We're offering that for free for anybody that wants to take advantage of that. So we have 4.5 hours of CPE plus the full hour of CPE for today that's available to you if you want. I'm just going to refer back to if you missed the session for the last session, we talked about patch impact analysis. I invite you to watch the OATUG recorded webinar that we talked about, and specifically the full, all 3 recorded webinars are available to you. And I want to emphasize this article that SafePaaS did recently on API security, because I think a lot of people think access controls is compliance. We've talked about API security as being critical. Those are all built into our rules. I talked about the FSCM mega API that's out there that are in a lot of seeded roles. SafePaaS did a good job of emphasizing that risk. And last but not least, if you need to get a hold of us, you can contact us at our website. You can contact and open a ticket. I will be assigned any tickets that are necessary coming out of this. So I should have my email address on here, but I don't. So I am just going to type it in here in case you need it, if you need to get a hold of me. And that email is jhair@erpra.net, but you can also either open a ticket or send me an email directly. So thanks for your time today. Appreciate it and look forward to seeing you back on the part 5 coming up in a couple weeks. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bob.